Welcome to the Crackin Backs Podcast, where we delve into the ever-changing world of sports medicine and biomechanics. Today, we are supercharged to have Dr. Tim Hewett, a titan in the field of biomechanics, ACL knee research, and sports medicine. Dr. Hewett is the leading researcher on ACL injuries, and today he discusses groundbreaking research that is turning heads with its potential to reduce ACL injury risks by a staggering 50%. He's here to spill the beans on the latest findings, including a study that sheds light on the effects of posterior chain involvement in post-ACL reconstruction and the importance of your calf muscles. Get ready for an eye-opening discussion on managing the high stakes of athletic performance while keeping your body and mind in top shape. Hold on, because Dr. Hewett is going to unravel the mystery of something referred to as the ramp lesion in the knee and why, if you have this condition, a repair of the meniscus is preferred over the removal of it. Buckle up, listeners. This episode is going to be an absolute game changer if you work with anyone with knees. Hey, I welcome you, Dr. Tim Hewett. I was looking into your background, both Dr. Terry and I, and we were really excited and impressed by what we had found about you. I know you don't think so, but we do. So,
what do you mean? I agree with you 100%.
Well, biomechanics and sports seems to be your forte, and we would love to hear. Let's get started on maybe some research that or some findings or something that you think is significant that you're working on or have worked on that may impact sports and athletic performance. And then we got a host of other questions for you.
So we got into this little guy called the ACL, or the anterior cruciate ligament, over 3 decades ago. So your ACL is this big. It's as big as your pinky. It's actually proportional. For an FYI, your PCL, your posterior, is proportionate to the size of your thumb. And they cross. That's why they're called the cruciate ligaments in the sagittal plane. And interestingly, and biomechanically, the center of rotation in the sagittal plane of your knee is where they cross, and that actually changes as you flex and extend the knee. We did a series of studies. We were the first to report that. We thought we were the first to report in American Journal of Sports Medicine that women were about 6 times more likely to rupture their ACL than men, and that took us through an odyssey that's lasted for decades, tens of millions of dollars in NIH funding, trying to figure out why that is and try to reduce that gap. And so, basically, what it comes down to is women or individuals at high risk for an ACL injury show 4 neuromuscular imbalances that put them at greater risk. The good news about it is neuromotor control, neuromuscular imbalance can be altered, can be modified. So what we showed in a series of studies is that you could actually reduce the risk of an ACL rupture in women or in general by 50% for all. This is a study we actually published in 1999 for all athletes, all ACL injuries with neuromuscular control training. You can reduce the risk of an ACL by half. Non-contact ACL injuries in female athletes you can reduce by 2/3.
Wow.
And pretty striking. And recently I'm getting ready to do a tour of Japan and Australia. I'm heading out on Tuesday and starting out actually with the ACL study group, which is the group of about the 100 top reputation and volume ACL surgeons in the world. And we get together and talk about the latest advancements in reconstruction, rehabilitation, and risk reduction. I don't like the word prevention because prevention says I know something's going to happen and I'm going to stop it from happening. Actually, what we do is reduce the relative risk of an ACL injury in a population using neuromotor control training. So what we showed in a series of studies was that you can reduce the risk of an ACL by looking at 4 patterns that high-risk athletes display. So the first is what we call ligament dominance. So what I mean by that is athletes who land and cut and let the ground reaction force hit their knee joint and hit their ACL rather than using their musculature to absorb and dissipate that force. So that's rather than being muscular dominant, they're ligament dominant. They rely on their ligaments, and ligaments are not designed to absorb and dissipate force. Muscles are. So again, the good news is we can modify those patterns and drill an athlete to activate the musculature that's going to protect the agonist of the ACL. So the second neuromuscular imbalance that athletes demonstrate is what we call quadriceps dominance. And women and athletes that tend to be at high risk, no matter the sex, basically utilize their quadriceps a lot to stabilize their knee joint. And the quad is a big muscle in front of your thigh, and it is a stabilizer of the knee joint, but it's actually an antagonist of the ACL. When you primarily activate your quadriceps and your knees at less than 45 degrees of flexion, as we're talking about with the ACL and PCL, if this is your tibia and you're primarily activating your quadriceps mechanism, you're pulling the tibia forward, and that's straining the ACL. So what we need for risk reduction, we need to teach the athlete to activate their posterior chain, their hammies, which was the primary agonist of the ACL, the glute complex, the hips, to reduce that strain on the ACL.
And don't you? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, I was just going to comment before you said that. I love how you describe the size and the perspective of the ACL and PCL. I did want you to back up just for a moment. We have both lay listeners and also doctors listening. When you said neuromuscular rehab early on, what are you referring to? Like what kind of neuromuscular?
So what I mean by that is training that is more than simple strength training in one plane on a machine, for example. Right. So what you're going to do is you're going to use exercises that add neural aspects, neural control, and enhancement of strengthening in combination with enhancement of neural control. So a lot of what we do is mid and high level plyometric training. And we can talk more about that, but a lot of plyometric training, a lot of dynamic balance training. That's both strengthening and altering neuromotor control profile.
Love it. All right, sorry, go ahead and continue with number 3.
So the third imbalance that we see in female athletes and high-risk athletes in general is leg dominance. So most athletes, almost all athletes, are leg dominant to one extreme or the other. We have a right leg dominant, which is the majority of the population. However, athletes at risk have much greater asymmetries one side versus the other, especially in things like hamstrings to quadriceps peak torque ratios. So again, those athletes, and very often you'll see an athlete who's really quad dominant on one side and not nearly as quad dominant on the other. That puts them at risk. That's leg dominance. And then the fourth neuromotor imbalance that we see that puts athletes at risk for an anterior cruciate ligament rupture is trunk dominance. And basically what I mean by that is when that athlete moves, cuts, lands, basically what they do is they allow a lot of translation of their trunk and their center of mass. And that's problematic because if you look at the biomechanics, so trunk is here, center of mass, and basically what happens if you, especially in the lateral plane, go lateral so that your center of mass, so you have a ground reaction force from the foot on landing, and the ground reaction force is directed at the center of mass, which is around your umbilicus. And when you allow that ground reaction force to go lateral to the hip and knee joint, it creates what we call an external knee abducting moment. It's abducting your distal tibia and pushes your knee and hip inward, which in clinical terms, it's kind of a garbage can term, but the idea is valgus, and especially dynamic valgus, allowing your hip and your knee to cave in during activities like single leg landing, that's single leg landing and cutting, that's how ACL injuries occur. So one of the reasons, for example, after I hit Japan for the ACL study group, I'm jumping the rest of the way across the pond to Australia and visiting Melbourne and Sydney and Gold Coast, Brisbane, because they have a sport called AFL, Aussie Rules Football League. And basically what they're doing is they go up for these speckies where they do these spectacular catches. Someone perturbs their trunk or their center of mass, goes lateral, and they land on one foot. And it's the per capita, per exposure, they have the highest rates of ACL injury in the world because of that. Because not only can you have athletes with a trunk dominant pattern, the sport pushes them into this trunk dominant position. And what I mean by that, another term for trunk dominance is lack of elite level core control. And that's really what we promote to reduce the risk, is core control at all levels, starting simple levels on balls, Swiss balls, and then moving up into dynamic single leg perturbation situations where they keep their core under control with their center of mass over the foot base with the knee and the hip in a stable neutral configuration. And that's how you reduce the risk of a anterior cruciate ligament rupture.
That is fantastic. So let's talk ACL reconstruction. One of your studies, you shared that the gastroc becomes, or the calf muscle for the lay people, it becomes affected, and there's a increase in muscular activity. What's the dynamics there?
So the gastroc, depending on the flexion angle of the knee, can be an agonist or an antagonist of the ACL. So training the gastroc under control is very important. So when you're doing training, so you start out, when you do plyometrics, the simple exercises are those exercises where you're keeping your hips and your knee in a neutral configuration, both in the frontal and sagittal planes. So just slight flexion of the hip and knee, and then you're just working your ankle. So wall bounces, wall jumps. And what you're doing is teaching your neuromotor system to activate the gastroc in a way that is going to be powered up, but in an agonist role for the ACL. So that the gastroc is an important force absorber. So again, absorb and dissipate that force before it hits the knee joint and before it hits the ACL. That's absolutely crucial.
How about,
I've been training my son, who's my training partner. He's been my training partner since he was 3 years old. I'm one of those really crazy dads. And he is. We just worked out last night, and he has a date tonight, but I told him we'll get in a short one before the date. It'll prime you up. literally, I've been training him since 3. You should see his gastrocs.
Yeah.
It's things of beauty,
They're
I can tell you.
like diamonds.
Yes, exactly. Diamonds in the rough.
Rough, right? Oh, that's great. So how, then how much of an influence does pes planus or a collapsing arch affect? I mean, you obviously look at the whole picture. Can you include
So
that
that
in the
is one of the
conversation?
theories. Pes planus or collapsing arch contributes. When we did the prospective biomechanical studies. So these studies, again, large NIH funded studies. For example, one NIH study we did in the 2000s, we looked at the entire county school system for Boone County, Kentucky.
Wow.
So that's where the CBG, the Cincinnati, that's where I'm flying out of on Tuesday. That's the Cincinnati airport's just across the river in northern Kentucky in Boone County, Kentucky. Well, I lived there at the time in the 2000s. Well, my farm was out there. And so I knew the athletic trainer, Bob Mangine, who was in charge of, through St. Elizabeth's system, he was in charge of all the athletic training for the entire county. And, it's interesting. Title IX is in the news these days. Title IX is what was enacted in 1973 that said we have to give equal opportunity, time, money to female sports that we give to male sports.
Yeah.
And Boone County actually had a Title IX lawsuit against them at the time. And a mother who was, her daughter was a cheerleader, she was on the school board and she was suing the county saying my daughter's not getting, as a cheerleader, she's not getting equal opportunity and money that football players are getting.
Yeah.
And so we went out to the county and said, we want to do a study looking at risk reduction of ACL injuries, especially in high risk athletes, which are most especially female athletes. And so they saw this as an opportunity for more than a decade, we started out and we just did the prospective studies looking at picking out those athletes who were at relatively high risk. And then what we did over time is follow them on to see so we looked at their biomechanics. We would bring entire teams, again, every girl who played soccer, basketball, or volleyball in the entire county by team would come into our lab at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. We'd test full body biomechanics, landing, cutting, running, jumping, test their muscle strength, test several different biomechanical and neuromuscular parameters. Then we'd let them go out and play, and we'd track them season over season over season. And that led to the most cited paper in AJSM all time in 2005.
Wow.
And so actually these studies have resulted in so AJSM, American Journal of Sports Medicine, AOSSM, has been in existence for 50 years. That's, it's interesting. Sports medicine has only been around for 5 decades.
Yeah.
And in those 5 decades, what I'm talking to you about now, reducing the risk of ACL injuries, especially in female athletes, resulted in 5 of the top cited papers of the year in those 50 years. So 10% of those. So this has been not only important, it's been impactful. It's really impacted clinical practice. And so what we showed in 2005 was we can show which athletes in a population are relatively high risk. And then we did a series of studies where we showed if you target those athletes at high risk with neuromotor controlled training that directly addresses those 4 neuromuscular imbalances, you can reduce the risk. And this is follow-up studies. So I did these studies with Kate Webster, who's based out of Melbourne, Australia, at Orthosport Victoria and La Trobe University. Again, highest risk of ACL injuries in the world. She works with a surgeon who's named Julian Feller, who's kind of, she would be the equivalent of Neil Elatrosh out in LA, the he's the team doc or the ACL doc to the AFL stars. And so they see something like, I could ask him, he's going to be with us in the Seco, Japan next week, in excess of 600 ACL reconstructions a year. And so basically we did a series of follow-up studies. So in 1999, which was the most cited paper in AJSM of the year, we showed you could reduce the risk in a population. It was about 1,300 athletes. We could reduce the risk by half in all ACLs and by 2/3 or 67% in non-contact ACL injuries in female athletes playing soccer, basketball, and volleyball. And so what Kate and I did actually 20 years later, we published this in 2018. We did a meta-analysis of all the meta-analyses in the literature. At the time, there were about a dozen of them. I call it our inception analysis. So we did a meta-analysis of meta-analyses 20 years later. And what did we find? When you looked at all the data together, which is tens of thousands of athletes, what you saw was we could reduce the risk by 50% in all athletes, including male athletes, and we could reduce the risk of non-contact ACL injuries by 2/3 or 67%, 20 years later. That's called consilience. That's when the data comes together and shows you the exact same result. And that's when you know you're right. That's when you know you've hit the nail on the head. So we can do this. Yeah. We can reduce the risk of ACL injuries in all athletes, all comers by 50% in non-contact. And non-contact is important, right? Because 70 to 80% of anterior cruciate ligament injuries are via a non-contact mechanism, meaning someone didn't take their knee out. You know, the tackle didn't fall on the lineman, the guard's knee. Basically, it's just you cutting, landing. For example, the most common mechanism in soccer, or properly termed football, is a defender reacting to an offensive player making a cut, making a move with the ball, them unanticipated, because the defender doesn't know where their body's going. So they're backing and then moving their trunk in one direction or the other in an unanticipated fashion. And they get that, well, it's basically a neuromotor control glitch, because they're moving their trunk in a way relative to their foot where the ground reaction force is coming from, and their hip and the knee, and they move their trunk in a way that takes their hip and knee out of a neutral configuration, move their trunk laterally, cause that dynamic valgus, and it happens very rapidly, and they rupture their ACL. So the good news in all that is that's a non-contact ACL injury. Someone didn't take your knee out, but that also means that it's modifiable because it's non-contact. So it's due to neuromotor control patterns in your own body. Now, if we can train you to not be ligament dominant, not be quad dominant, not be leg dominant, and not be trunk dominant in chaotic environments, again, basically what we showed in the lab. So the first series of studies we did, like I said, I'm an old power lifter, have done plyometrics most of my life, basically applied what we knew from people like Don Chu and Vern Gambetta and a lot of other people I learned from, including physios, chiros, ATCs, you name it. I'm a sponge for training. And so basically what we did, and this was a first series of studies in 1996, which we showed in the lab, we could alter those biomechanical profiles. So in high-risk female athletes, we significantly reduce ligament dominance. So the way you see ligament dominance is we do a box drop vertical test and basically look for that dynamic collapse. And basically what we showed was after 8 weeks of intensive training with resistance training, plyometrics, a lot of dynamic balance training, we could reduce that dynamic inward collapse that loads the ligament. And you see in the frontal plane, the big movers of the body, the quads, the hammies, the even the glutes, are designed primarily to absorb and dissipate force through flexion extension. Those are the primary movers. When you allow a lot of frontal plane movements, those big movers are not well designed to absorb and dissipate force in the frontal plane. So if we can show an athlete to utilize those big absorbers, the big muscle groups, to absorb and dissipate force in flexion extension and not allow a lot of dynamic valgus, we can reduce the risk of ligament dominance, allowing that ground reaction force to go to the ligament rather than being dissipated by the musculature. But we can also show them, we can turn up the posterior chain. And many athletes don't activate when they're landing, when they're cutting, when they're perturbed and land on a single leg, they're not activating their glutes and hammies in a way that's going to help that ACL, that's going to take strain off of that ACL. But you can, with drilling, you can teach them and incorporate in their neuromotor pattern those posterior chain dominant patterns, and we showed that you could significantly decrease that quad dominance. You can do the same side to side. So you start out with double leg plyometrics, then you move to dynamic single leg. And then it's interesting because single leg training actually enhances symmetry. It's counterintuitive, but it's exactly what it does. If you do a lot of dynamic plyometrics and single leg dynamic balancing on a single leg, and then you come back together into double leg tasks, you're going to be more symmetric side to side, especially in relatively quad hamstring dominant patterns. So if you look, for example, in that 96 paper, which was again the top cited paper of the year in AJSM, we showed we increased those relative by a lot, by about a third in these young girls that were especially quad dominant and leg dominant. We made them more symmetric and enhanced on both sides their relative hamstring to quadriceps peak torque. And then finally, with this, especially plyometric training, but also dynamic balance training, we showed that we could show them how to control their center of mass. So if people always want one pill. What's the one pill? Yeah. They always say, Hewett, I don't want to train for an hour. Our training is kind of intensive, and we have been criticized for that. This guy is a powerlifting plyometric meathead. We don't want to train 3 days a week for 90 minutes, which is what we do for a minimum of 2 months, preferably 3. And they say, we just want the one pill. What do you do? What's the one pill that's going to prevent? And I always tell them, we're not preventing anything. We're reducing the risk. Well, what's going to prevent my girl from having an ACL injury? And I tell them this: if you're so lazy that you're not going to do the work that you need to do, because if you do the work, not only are you going to reduce the risk of your athlete, your daughter, or your kid's ACL injury, you're going to make them a better athlete because they're going to have better control of their center of mass and they're going to be more powerful. For example, in that 96 paper, we showed that their vertical jump went up 10% plus. So if you're too lazy to do that, you only want one thing: teach them to do single leg plyometrics, dynamic bounding, landing, balance with their center of mass over their foot base, with their hip and their knee in a stable neutral configuration, especially in the frontal plane. If you can, and the cool thing about this is when risk goes up is adolescence. Boys and girls prior to adolescence have similar relative risk, and then boom, we can go in a whole series of another series of studies that was funded out the NIH about when this risk goes up and why it goes up. And again, that's a whole nother book that we wrote. So the point is, if you can teach them to do this and you drill it and drill it and drill it, you're going to be able to not only make them safer, you're going to be able to make them a better athlete. Mm-hmm. So that's the way you sell this to. Now, the parents are very interested in safety. So very often we get our studies and our programs out at the schools funded by the boosters because the parents are interested in safe athletes. Awesome. Coaches should be interested in safe athletes too. I mean, the NFL, just look at the NFL. Basically, the NFL, who's in the playoffs? The ones that have won the war of attrition. Right. That's basically what it is. So the safer you keep your athletes, the more of your athletes are going to stay out on the field by mid and end season. But again, many people, especially the athletes themselves, they don't. Risk reduction is not primarily in their brains. Yeah. What they're about is performance. And I can show you, and I can see this. I train older people, you name it. I train the entire gamut because it's not what I do. I'm a research scientist, but I love to hit the gym. And I tell you people all the time that simple balance exercises, the worse you are, especially like a young girl after the pubertal growth spurt, the adolescent growth spurt is out of control. So basically what she is she's raised her center mass off the ground. She's up on stilts now, and she's got more of that mass to control, and it's redistributed in ways that she's not used to. And that's a big reason so that when girls hit the peak height velocity, so for most girls that's age 11, 12 years old, after they've had that big growth spurt, they're out of control. For example, a lot of soccer coaches you'll talk to say, man, this girl went from the best player I had to a very low level after that adolescent growth spurt. Because again, so let's talk about it. I like fast cars. I don't like anything else fast, but I do like my fast cars. Now I stay away from other fast stuff. But the fast cars, if you look at boys and girls, so they start out at the similar level. So let's talk about machines and motors. So both boys and girls start out with, let's say, a Prius with a Prius engine, and the motor is matched to the machine. The motor or the engine is matched to the chassis. Then what happens is, in girls, this happens 18 months to 2 years before boys. Girls are always way ahead of us on everything. You right. Name it. Maturity-wise, that is. So girls hit this growth spurt, and they go from a Prius to, let's say, a Chevy Malibu, with somewhere between a Prius and Chevy Malibu engine, okay? Now, what happens with boys? So a year and a half later, us immature goofs hit this growth spurt, and boom, we go from a Prius to a Cadillac-sized chassis, right? Now, we don't get a Cadillac motor. We get somewhere between a Porsche and a Tesla motor. So we're like this. So how do I know this? Well, it's relatively simple. Anything vertical jump. I love jumping, as you might have gotten. So vertical jumps are the best single measure of single whole body power, right? And it's one of the most reliable, reproducible measures you can get in athletics. You jump the same height again and again and again. So we've done these studies in the Boone County cohort and multiple other cohorts. So we've done this down at Texas Tech University with a friend of mine, an orthopedic surgeon. Believe it or not, we were doing this in gyms in Texas Tech, which is in Lubbock, Texas, in June during their physicals. It was 115 degrees in the gym with no air conditioning. Believe it or not, we tested over 600 kids in this gym. And basically what you show is the data is very reproducible. As sweaty as you get, the data, you still show it the same way. So we did, that study was a cross-sectional study. We looked at boys versus girls, but we also have done that study longitudinally, where we took the Boone County cohort and kept measuring the kids year after year after year. However you do it, as girls mature, they get bigger, their body mass goes up, their levers, their tibia and the femur, the longest levers in the body, which experience some of the highest torques at the knee. As they get bigger, their vertical jump, their body power stays the same. So they're bigger, they're more massive, they have the same amount of relative to body mass and body height. So basically, they're the same. So how do I know that? Because their vertical jump doesn't go up. Their body power doesn't go up. Now in boys, what you see is even though they're getting greater relative body mass, they're getting that Cadillac, they can displace that center of mass a greater distance off the ground. So they're getting significantly more power relative to their body size after the adolescent growth spurt, which we assume is mainly due to the testosterone burst. Yeah. So basically, girls stay the same. So they're going from a Chevy Prius to a Malibu, and their motor is somewhere in between the two. The best they do is a Malibu. Now, that's the tough part. Yeah. However, as we all know, you can enhance the motor. You can enhance the power in any athlete. I can enhance give me 6 to 8 weeks, and especially those high-risk girls post-adolescent. And here's the great part about that. So I trained boys for years and years, mainly Olympic lifters, power lifters, and wrestlers, mainly worked with. So if you get a boy and he's in the middle of that adolescent growth spurt, and we're all aware of it from, say, freshman year to senior year in high school, he's got this massive burst already, and you take him for the summer. So you get usually between, spring and winter sports, or spring and fall sports, you have about 2 months. You should have 3, but you don't, because, there's so many other issues and things that they have to do. You basically get about 8 weeks. In 8 weeks, if you're comparing to a control population, boys, you can get, you're lucky if you get like a 3 to 6% boost with any kind of training, resistance training, plyometric training, jump training, whatever you do. You're lucky in the background of they're getting this big motor spurt. You're lucky if you get just a portion of that. However, in girls, because they're starting at a relatively low baseline, you can get huge increases in power output, in neuromotor control. I mean, we're not talking 5%, we're talking 10 to 50%. So it's really rewarding. So when I started working with these young adolescent girls, when you realize, man, this is really rewarding, because you can really alter their neuromotor profile. You can really enhance power output. So you can increase that motor output so that you no longer have this machine motor mismatch or this chassis engine mismatch. And again, completely rewarding. And along with that, when you do that, you alter that whole profile. So you're decreasing that ligament dominance, you're decreasing quad dominance, you're decreasing leg dominance, you're decreasing trunk dominance, all while you're getting a better athlete. Really rewarding, really fun work to do. That's what I've been doing for so long.
That's awesome. Going back a little bit, you talked about dealing with, the parents and dealing with the coaches. You said, Coach, I wish coaches really got to know this. How do you face the pressures of this return to play when you got these kids who are in high school trying to get back, and we all know it's 9 months to a year, but you got these coaches that are pressuring. How do you handle that high demand for performance versus injury prevention and trying to get them to prevent it, but if it happens, get them back in? How do you handle that?
So this is a huge challenge. So what we did with the Boone County cohort and multiple other cohorts is we kept following the kids, as I told you, over time. And what kind of blew our minds, and we were the first to report this as well. Basically, what happens is if a kid is going back to the same level of sport after rupturing their ACL and either having it reconstructed or not, their risk of a second ACL injury goes from, well, in boys, the risk of an ACL injury in high school sports is about 1 to 3%. In girls, it's significantly higher. It's in the range of, say, 3 to 6%. Their risk of a second ACL tear, either on the reconstructed side or the uninjured side, is 20 to 40%. When we first reported that back in 2010, that blew people's minds. And that study actually won the most cited paper of the year in 2010. So we showed their risk, if they were going back at 1 year, was about 24%. And their risk at 2 years of a second ACL tear was about 30%. It was 29.5%, about 30%. Now, people said, you're crazy, because surgeons were reporting risk of second tears was like, 2% to 5%. That absolutely not. It's because they weren't following their patients with high fidelity like we do. Basically, when Kate Webster and Julian Feller down in Melbourne, when they looked at their data, they came up with the exact same number that we did. Again, conciliance of data points. It was 29-30%. Is what they reported. And the group in Sydney, again, tons of ACLs. I mean, so we were doing in relatively small cohorts. They're doing in a huge, thousands of athletes. They showed the exact same number, again, about 30%. And like male athletes who are doing lots of speckies and going way up high in the air and getting perturbed, their risk when they're going back to Aussie rules football is 40%. So we're talking 20 to 40%. So that's an unacceptably high risk. Now, what you have to think about, prior injury is always the best predictor of another injury. That's always when you look at anything, prior injury is the best predictor. So what you have, somebody who's had an ACL injury and reconstruction is your highest risk athlete. So and this is our passion now. This is what we're trying to figure out. And we're looking at this in many ways, through rehab techniques, through surgical techniques. We're following up to see how with our risk reduction techniques that we just talked about. So on an average athlete, we know we can reduce the risk by between half and 2/3. Our working hypothesis is this: because these are the highest risk athletes and they've already had an injury, we can reduce that risk with neuromotor targeted, very highly targeted neuromotor training. We can reduce that risk by half of that, which means half of 2/3 is a third, and that half of 50% is a quarter. So our hypothesis is we can reduce that risk between, say, 50 and 25%, which is great, because that means we can reduce that risk that's now 20 to 40% somewhere to 10 to 20%. Because again, these athletes are at super high risk, and there's basically two populations you look at, and this makes it very problematic to be able to do those. So we're doing those risk prediction studies and trying to target our training to that risk profile. Here's the difficulty with it: you have two populations. So if you look at the psychological aspects of this, so the same group in Melbourne, Australia, Kate Webster and Julian Feller, came up with a psychological profile called the ACL RSI. I highly recommend it. It's free. You can get it. It used to be 12 questions, so it's a pro. It's a patient-reported outcome. And they've actually got a validated short form that's only 6 questions, and we ask it of every athlete longitudinally. And I suggest you use it. The best way to use it is over time to see whether they're getting better, whether they're getting worse, whether they're staying the same. And what you see is we track these kids from the time they get out of their surgery till they return to sport and beyond. And basically what you see in that is the same thing you see with, interestingly, the psych data is very similar to the biomechanic data. You see two populations and you're on an inverted U-shaped curve. So you have your sweet spot, which is the top of the inverted U up here. And then you've got two populations that are at risk. The one over here, which is the one very often it's a she, and she says, man, I'm really scared to go back to my sport. On the psychological, I'm really anxious about getting back to sport. Girls report more than boys. You know what a teenage boy is like.
Yeah.
You're lucky if you get them to say, but anyway, what you see is that the girls report more, they're more anxious, they have more fear of returning. But also, if you look at their biomechanics, they show that they tend to be more leg dominant, quad dominant, ligament dominant, and trunk dominant. You can pick them out, and they're at high risk. So they're the ones, they're at and we showed this at Mayo Clinic with a team of people led by Melissa Allen. We showed these young girls, if they're going back to the same level of soccer, their risk of a second tear is 35%. I mean, it was actually 34%, but a third, their risk. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the other bottom of the U, you have a young, usually male, 18, 19 years old, super confident, no fear, no anxiety. Boom, I'm ready to go back. Let me go, doc. Let me go. I'm 3 months out. Let me go. I'm ready to go. I need to, I tore it in football and I need to start basketball camp. Well, no anxiety, no fear, total confidence. And you look at their biomechanics and boom, they pass through every return to sport test we got. They look great. Both of them are at high risk and they're both going to have a risk of tearing their ACL between 20 and 40%. Now, Les, she's probably at about a third risk, and he's probably about a quarter risk, but high risk. So how do you pick out that patient that you say, whoa, you need to wait? And that's what we're trying to figure out. So what we do now is we're using every technology we can get a hold of. So we're using full 3D virtual reality motion analysis, mainly working with a company out of Cleveland called Tracer, which is a great tool. And then we're using onboard IMUs, so inertial measurement units, so wearables. We're using those on the athletes, both in the lab, in the clinic, out on the field. And then we're also doing force plate analysis. So the company with wearables we're working with is Dorsavi. They're based also out of Melbourne, Australia. And another company based out of Menlo Park, California, Sparta Science, whereas we're using force plate analysis. And we're just looking at every biomechanical, psychological parameter that we can to see if we can figure out who those two populations on both ends of that inverted U are, who are at high risk, not to say don't play or don't go back, but to target their training, both neuromotor and psychological learning and training, to reduce their relative risk. Again, do we think we're going to wipe out that risk by 50 to 67%? No, probably close to between a third and a quarter. But that's in that high risk population, if we can cut out half of those re-injuries, that's second injury. The first injury is devastating, right? I mean, you're out of your sport. You're probably not going to be back somewhere 6 months to a year. These days it's closer to a year, and most docs are actually pushing, minimum 9 to 12 months. Time is not a good predictor. Time doesn't really predict neuromotor control or psychological readiness. It just doesn't. So what we need to do is figure out who those kids are, look at their profile, and then target their neuromotor imbalances or their psychological, their fears, their anxieties, their confidence level, so that we can normalize that and decrease their relative risk, hopefully by around half. We're not going to save them all, because I can tell you, when that second injury occurs, you think that first injury was devastating. Well, if it's the graft itself, not only is the athlete and the parent and the coach devastated, the surgeon's devastated, whereas on the contralateral side, the surgeon might not be as devastated because it's not his beautiful graft that he put